Yes, I found a flaw in the model that I perceived is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
Yeah, growth is good for sure, but what's the cost? I mean, these aren't paper clips we're talking about. That's how one developer explained it to me. These are human beings, right? Who make the games that we play and care about. You know, even like a big game, like I said, Fortnite, it has people who care about it. This is their passion, you know, that went into this. They made the characters, they made the worlds, they made the item. And like I said, they suffer systemic crunch. They suffer clinical burnout. And so these are real serious health harms that developers face.
Hi everyone, this is John Hansen from the Systemic Justice Project and the Flaw magazine at Harvard Law School. In this, the third episode of Flaw School, hosts Jasenia Class and Ria Singh sit down with law student Pantho Syed to discuss the pressures faced by video game developers in an industry dominated by corporate giants. Pantho explores how the relentless drive for profit and shareholder value results in systemic crunch, clinical burnout, and compromised game quality, raising critical questions about harmful power dynamics in gaming. Stay tuned as we dive deep into the darker side of game development and what might be done about it. Welcome to Flaw School, the podcast about the flaws in the law.
Hey, welcome to Flaw School, a podcast that explores the flaws in our legal system. We're today's hosts. I'm Ria Singh.
And I'm Jasenia Class. Every 2 weeks, we interview law students to uncover the role of corporate actors in producing many of our most urgent social problems, and the troubling tale of corporate actors shaping, bending, capturing, and breaking the law in their favor. In this episode, we'll be discussing the pressure placed on game developers by the corporatization of the modern video game industry.
Today, we're joined by Pantho Syed, a current law student. Welcome to Flaw School. Class is in session.
Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here.
We'd love to start out by asking you a couple questions about yourself and what inspired you to write this topic, Pantho.
So I got inspired to write about the video gaming industry primarily because, well, I play a lot of video games. I've been a big fan of games since I was very young, and all sorts of video games. And in terms of writing about it, the corporatization, I guess I became interested just because it's been in the news. If you follow gaming news like I do, just, the issues that developers face, the fact that there are big companies who make a lot of these games, and especially, what made this issue more salient was the fact that the gaming industry is so massive now. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Companies like Nintendo, EA, Activision, which you might have heard of, those are all worth billions of dollars and hire thousands of employees. And so this really is an industry that's something to be feared, for sure.
Yeah, and you really feel that when you jump into the beginning of your article. So you start off the piece by introducing us to the hype around the release of a new game. After 4 years of rumors, memes, anticipation, the game is finally released and it's a dud. And according to your research, this happens all the time. These kinds of games, AAA games, are getting more and more expensive for people to make, but are falling flat with gamers again and again. What's going on here?
Yeah, that's a really puzzling conundrum that I think, again, is being more emphasized in the news over and over with games like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, Cyberpunk 2077, Redfall. Not to say that every game is like this, of course. There are great, Legend of Zelda games, God of War, etc. But what I understand is the cause of sort of these duds, right, or the flops, as folks in the business like to call them, are really because of developers. And I don't want you to take that the wrong way. Developers are great, and by developers, I mean all the folks who create a video game, be that the coders and the programmers, the artists who come up with the characters, the folks who design levels, and the writers. But their work to the point they're overworked such that the quality of these massive AAA games, think Call of Duty, Fortnite, etc., really suffers. And we call that crunch. And so crunch is a big problem in the industry.
Yeah, so when reading the article, I was really interested in what crunch looked like. It seems like developers are being squeezed from both sides. As you write, quote, large publishing companies and venture capitalists, quote, motivated to increase shareholder profits, contract with studios to release games on specific deadlines and with apparent revenue increasing features, on the one hand, while studios accept these conditions without worker buy-in. How do we get to a system like this where crunch is just so common and developers are being put in this situation?
I think first I should describe what crunch is, because I think it's a term that we've all heard in our own lives, and it's something that I didn't have much idea about until I talked with some folks, primarily Dr. Rachel Cowart, who's a research psychologist and especially on the psychology of video games. And she explained to me that we have two kinds of crunch. Situational crunch, which is something we all face. There are moments in our lives where we're just very busy, you have to suck it up and get to work, right? But what many developers in the industry face is systemic crunch, which is where you work an extra amount of hours for an exceeding amount of time. And that's not just once in a while. That's for a very prolonged amount of time, to the point where you could even face burnout, clinical burnout, where you can't function as well in your day-to-day life. And so your first question before that was, how do we get here? And I think the long and short answer of it is just the culture of the gaming industry. The very simplified version is, games really took off in like the 1970s in sort of this counterculture space. It was a dude in his garage, right? Just hammering on the keys, making a product for the world to enjoy. And so we still have this image, of course, with like indie games, which I discuss in my article. But, Fortnite's not made by one guy in his garage, right? It's a massive team, with a ton of resources, many people involved. And like I mentioned before, billions of dollars, complex financing, major companies. But the culture is still, it's almost like you're just a bunch of folks, hammering away at the keys to really make this passion project. And so there's a sort of cultural incentive to really work as hard as you can because you love games and you want to make something great. So that's a very sort of simplified answer.
It sounds like there's a ton of stakeholders in the video game development industry. Not only are there the ones we might typically think of, like the devs themselves, but the publishers, marketing agencies, and of course, the gaming community. But by your description, it seems that these stakeholder interests are being pushed to the side in favor of attempts to maximize shareholder value. How do these come into conflict, and why are these big box game companies deciding that it's okay to sacrifice the quality of their games and the players' experiences in service of the shareholders?
Yeah, that's definitely a great question. And, I think what's interesting about that is that's the feeling that many, I think, lay gamers, myself included, before this research, really thought what was going on, that these big companies were just screwing over us gamers, right, just to make terrible games. The reality is that I think the industry is a lot more nuanced than that. And that was very apparent from what I learned with folks I spoke with, both inside and outside of the industry. And so, then first of all, I should caveat that the gaming industry is really massively varied. You'll have giant companies like EA, like I mentioned before, or Ubisoft or Nintendo, but you still have indie games where it's just a handful of folks, making a game. But for the most part, the industry sort of functions with, I'll say, three key players. First, you have the publishers, right? So those could be like Ubisoft or EA or Activision, other, giant brands. And they'll typically, they're the ones who market the games, right? Bring them to audiences. But they also often own a lot of the prominent intellectual properties. So like Warner Brother Games is a good example. They own like Batman, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, things like that. And they'll contract with the sort of second element, which are the studios. The studios hire the third element, all the developers and the folks who work for them. and the studio management basically lead the games to production, right? Just make the game, is give it to the publisher. Now, the studios will contract with the publishers to make games. The publishers are the primary source of funding and reputation, right? So if I'm a studio that wants to make, let's say, a Lord of the Rings game, I have to contract with Warner Brothers Games because they have the IP, and they're going to give me the funding necessary to do that. And so what that means is, as the studio, I'm beholden to whatever the publisher demands in the contract if I want to make the Lord of the Rings game. And so that could mean various deadlines for funding milestones, and that could be requirements for what they want in the game. Is it multiplayer? Is it, how much content, should there be? How many levels? Things like that. And so, to go to your question, sort of the big box companies, sacrificing quality in games, the company, as we think of that, really depends on, are we talking about the publisher or the studio? Because the studio heads, might be with their developers, wanting to make a great game, not wanting to overwork people to the bone. But the publisher, who might be incentivized in profit, not to, I'm using Warner Brothers Games as an example, but maybe all they want is profit. Maybe they don't care about the Lord of the Rings games. Not that I know that for sure, right? But, that their incentives might not align with the studios, and so they'll put on the deadlines that they want. Maybe they need to coincide with the Amazon series, right? Like the first day the Amazon series comes out, we also want our game released. And so the studio's out of luck. They have to meet that deadline, or, the publisher will just pull the contract. So I hope that all made sense.
It definitely did, but it's honestly pretty sad to hear that an industry that seems, I guess, more simple, like the gaming industry, it's so interesting to see just the imbalance of power. And to me, this strikes at a bigger problem. When I hear you describe the industry, I keep thinking about who has the power in a given situation and how that's being used to legitimize inequality between the devs and larger corporate actors like studios and brands, which leads to more crunch. How do you think the power differentials are legitimized in the gaming industry, and what narratives are you seeing to support the current system?
Yeah, I think you're really on the money there. I think there is a lot of power differentials. Like I mentioned before, publishers have the IP and they have the funding, right? So they can really dictate, what kind of game gets made with their products. Because everybody wants to play a Spider-Man game. Everybody wants to play a SpongeBob game. And again, games are expensive. You have a lot of elements that go into them. You have voice actors, you have, level designers, you have production assistants, you have marketing people, right? The list goes on and on. And I think in terms of narratives, I think that's a really sort of important aspect to all of this. And something that might be kind of, I think, unique to the gaming industry in a lot of ways is that, and what folks explained it to me as was, gaming is sort of like a cool kids club. Who doesn't want to work on video games? Be like, yeah, I make games for a living. That sounds awesome, right? And, a lot of young folks really want to do that, especially if you have some sort of computer science or artistic background. You might want to go into games. There are even game design schools and college programs that I've met with folks who are enrolled in those. So it really is becoming more and more popular. Then the flip side is that if everybody wants to make games and they get certified and take classes and such to do that, then if you're the employer, whether that be the studio, I guess primarily the studio, right? You can hire anybody you want to make the games because, let's say I, as Panther, want to work for Ubisoft, right? They make Assassin's Creed and a whole bunch of other famous titles. And be like, I love Assassin's Creed, which is true, I do. And I want to do that, but I don't want to suffer crunch, right? I just want my 40-hour work week, that's it. Well, Ubisoft can turn around and be like, yeah, Panther might not want to, but Ria, you might really not mind that. You might like Assassin's Creed more than I do. and you like it so much more that you're going to want to work harder for it. And so why would Ubisoft hire me and not you? Because they know you'll do the same amount of work. And so it's very difficult to produce change when you have folks who are so motivated to the point that they'll work as hard as they want to, because they know if they don't, they'll hire somebody else. And that same dynamic is reflected with studios and publishers, right? Like, studios might be great, and like, we don't crunch our developers. We don't try to meet insane deadlines. We want to have high quality product, even if it means we might take a little bit of a pay cut. The publisher will be like, okay, that's great. So you won't work on a Lord of the Rings game then, because somebody else will. Somebody else wants the credit to make those high-profile games, because, again, it boosts the studio's prestige, and, it gives them a lot of money. And so studios and developers, in that sense, are in the same bind, because it's so cool to work on these things that anybody will give their right arm to do it. And, again, that just leads these, norms of crunch and really intense labor and, perhaps quality sacrifice in games, because, that's the narrative. It's so cool to do it.
So it sounds to me that all of this focus on growth comes with a lot of problems. Game companies are trying to capitalize on the hype and pursue unsustainable growth with huge production costs. And you seem to characterize it throughout the piece as more or less negative, in the sense that it's harming workers, and it's harming gaming industry, which is definitely concerning. But a lot of other people might think that growth is incredibly important and critical to this process. It breeds innovation, which should create better graphics, better gameplay, and hopefully quicker and more hype content. And what would you say to those people who hear your concerns about growth impacting labor, but still think overall it's worth it at the end of the day to get the best version of Assassin's Creed?
I hear your point very well. And I don't want to say, again, that all games are bad. We've had a lot of really great games in recent years, both at like the small indie level, with just a couple of folks, but also at the big AAA level. Like I mentioned, like the Legend of Zelda games are masterpieces, right? And they're made by Nintendo, the biggest gaming company like ever. And so, yeah, I hear your point for sure. Well, I think there are two sort of ways I'll respond to you. The first is in terms of, are games better? And arguably, maybe not. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, the nature of what we call a game is changed. I don't know if you've heard the term live service, but that's what games are trending towards. It used to be that you buy a box at the store, had the disc, you plug it in your Xbox, and you play the game, and you're done. But now, with something like Fortnite, right, you just keep playing it non-stop, and to add new content all the time sequentially. And so we're getting more and more content, but if that's better, it's hard to say. And an attorney actually in video game law, Brandon Huffman, explained it to me like this. I guess I should say not related to his capacity as an attorney. But a game like Fortnite, right, has so much you can do. Maybe not one player might not like all of that. Like, I might not like all the different elements of it. I might like one or two things. And so I'll just play it for that reason. But you, Jasenia, might like the other thing that I don't like. And so from the Fortnite creator's perspective, Epic Games, well, I want to keep those two things in there because it draws more people in. And let's add a third thing. Let's add a fourth thing, because it draws so many people in over time. And so they don't need you or I to keep playing all the time, just every so often to make purchases. That way, they'll keep making revenue. So the end product might not necessarily be quote-unquote better, but it draws in the maximum amount of players at any given time, so that increases the bottom line. The other way I'd respond to your criticism is that, yeah, growth is good for sure, but what's the cost? I mean, these aren't paper clips we're talking about. That's how one developer explained it to me. These are human beings, right, who make the games that we play and care about. Even like a big game, like I said, Fortnite, it has people who care about it. This is their passion, that went into this. They made the characters, they made the worlds, they made the items. And that's their creation. And just to say that, oh, well, the game's better, so too bad, right? I mean, like I said, they suffer systemic crunch. They suffer a clinical burnout. unrelated, I think, sort of to the crunch element, but in terms of the folks who do like the community engagement, trust and safety, like, making sure like chat rooms and stuff are okay. Those people get harassed so much, they suffer PTSD even, right? And so these are real serious health harms that developers face. And I think just to ignore them and say, oh, well, growth is good, we have bigger companies, bigger games, I'd really caution to be like, well, who's it affecting, right?
Thank you for raising those. Those are really serious concerns. It sounds like the pressure is really mounting for game developers and other people in this field. What are people in the industry doing to fight back?
Yeah, that's the question. Of course, this isn't just something that I came up with. Folks in the industry are well aware of these issues, and I think there are a couple of avenues. One is just leaving those big companies, those big AAA companies, and making their own studios, indie game studios, right? And those, I think, I don't want to characterize all indie games as like the magic antidote to AAA, because, it's hard to start your own business. It's hard to release a game out into the world, and it might do great, it might not. Indie devs I spoke with mentioned things like that. It can be tricky. Even if you don't have those deadlines, you have to pay the bills. And there can be abuse too in like bigger indie studios as well, which I've read about. But that being said, that's an alternative if you don't want to work under Ubisoft's, iron fist, right, in terms of deadlines, then, make your own and really make the kind of game you want to make. The other thing that's come up a bit is unionization, like in other industries, right? If developers got together and be like, we're saying we don't want to work this hard, you might expect, okay, well, there might be some change in the industry. But there are a couple of, I think, roadblocks to unionization. One is, like I mentioned, the nature of the industry, where you have publishers contract with studios, and then studios employ the developers to make the games. The developers in a studio might all unionize. Granted, that might be a problem because the studio might have 10 people, so it's tricky to unionize something like that, versus at, Epic Games, which might have hundreds. But even if you did unionize at a big studio, or a big-ish studio, then you have the problem of the publisher's contract, because the developers aren't employed by the studio, Developers aren't employed by the publisher. They're employed by the studio. So if the publisher's contract requires crunch, unionization doesn't deal with that, because the studios are like, we hear you, but we can't do anything about that because of our contract. And I think the other issue to unionization is the fact that there are so many studios, right? Hundreds and thousands of them out there of all sizes. So within one studio, apart from the biggest companies that like Nintendo or whatnot, unionization might not have much impact. One solution that might be sort of a way around that is sort of what Attorney Huffman, who I mentioned earlier, described as a horizontal unionization. So think like the Screen Actors Guild, right, SAG, or the Communication Workers Union. Across an industry, all those folks, the actors or the writers, will unionize and then make demands on the industry. So I know like animators, for example, have something like that within film, and I believe in other areas too. And so that might be a possibility in the future. But unionization so far has some hurdles.
For our listeners out there who are avid gamers, this all can sound super overwhelming. They want quality games, but at the same time, hearing about the incredible amounts of crunch, burnout, and layoffs in the industry, gamers might feel a little bit icky and uneasy hyping up the next release. What can gamers and fans do to try and pressure this industry to change? And how can they make their voices heard?
Yeah, that's definitely something I've thought about, during this whole project, as somebody who really, loves games as well. I think the biggest thing is just being a lot more mindful about, what we play and, what we're choosing to buy. Because it's so easy to just, I think, jump on buying the next Madden game or Assassin's Creed. And granted, every time one of those comes out, there's so much online, social media discourse about, oh, this game sucks. They didn't make anything new from the last game, right? Madden, 2024 is the same as 2023. They just changed a couple players. They just keep complaining.
but then folks are still buying it, right? So why should EA listen to you on Twitter if you just keep buying their games, right? And so I think thinking about the fact that, look, if we want to play games, you don't have to look at the biggest releases. There's a whole world of indie games out there, made by folks who are, just a couple people, right? A few heads in a shop. And you might really like those, right? There's artistic, innovative, and, you're supporting small businesses in that sense. The other thing you could think about is just the online discourse, which isn't something I wrote about in my paper too much, but it came up in a lot of our discussions. Like I mentioned, this sort of trust and safety community engagement folks suffer some of the worst harassment from developers. And I think in a lot of ways, maybe gamers have a right to be upset if something like Cyberpunk 2077, which is infamous for how terrible it was at launch, it was broken, right? There's no way to dance around that. It was not a complete game, somebody dropped the ball. But all the hate that went towards developers on projects like that was, probably not warranted, because they suffered immense deadlines from their publisher, who was like, the dev said, it's not finished. Publisher's like, too bad, publish it anyway. And so a lot of times our ire as players is really misdirected, and it hurts people really badly. So I think, it's really important, just what we say and who we say it to, I think matters no less than, what we buy and what we actually play.
Pantho, thank you so much for that, leaving us on a good and hopeful note. Despite the craziness of the gaming industry, I think your passion for this topic is so obvious, and I think you have inspired gamers, developers, and everyone involved to create that change and step up. But I have unfortunate news, which is that we have reached our limit. That is all the time we have for today. Pantho, thank you so much for joining us on Law School. We're happy to talk about the video game industry with you any day.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
I also wanted to say thank you for a wonderful conversation. I feel like I went into this not knowing too much, and now I've come away with so much more knowledge, and now I can share this information with my brother, who is an avid gamer, and so I'll extend his thanks to you as well.
I could not agree more with Jasenia. I remember reading the article and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I have no idea what the gaming industry is. Like, how would I ever be able to comprehend this? And from reading your article and also listening to you talk about it, I feel so knowledgeable. So thank you. And I will also extend this to all of the gamers I know, because it's very, very important. But thank you, Jasenia, for being a wonderful co-host.
Same to you. And to our listeners out there, if you're interested in reading Pantho's full article or learning more about the flaws in our legal system, check out The Flaw magazine at theflaw.org.
If you enjoyed this episode, first make sure to check out the show notes. There will be some awesome links and references there. And make sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also check out flawschool.org for more content. Thank you all for listening. Looking forward to talking at you in the future. Class is dismissed.